Sarah had always been someone who believed that wisdom came with age. She had seen it in her parents, in the older teachers she admired, and in the elderly members of her community who shared their stories with the younger generation. But as she sat by the window of her small cottage, watching the sun set behind the hills, Sarah couldn't help but wonder how much of her own life had been truly lived with wisdom. Looking back, it felt as though her life had been divided into two halves. The first half filled with dreams and ambition, and the second half filled with reflection and learning. At the age of 82, Sarah had lived through decades of triumphs and failures, joys and heartbreaks, moments of great success and times of deep regret. Now, as she sat in the comfort of her quiet home, she often reflected on how far she had come and what she had learned along the way. Born in a small town to hardworking parents, Sarah had always been determined to do more than just survive. Her parents, though loving, had been burdened with financial struggles. They worked tirelessly to make ends meet, but their efforts were often overshadowed by the realities of life. From an early age, Sarah knew that if she wanted more than what her parents had, she would have to work for it. She would have to fight for her dreams. It wasn't easy. The road to education wasn't always clear, and there were times when Sarah had to make sacrifices. But she never gave up. She studied late into the night, devouring books and learning everything she could. It was during these early years that she learned one of her most valuable lessons: the importance of perseverance. "There's no substitute for hard work," Sarah's father had told her one evening as they sat together at the kitchen table. "You have to keep pushing, even when it seems impossible." Those words had stayed with Sarah throughout her life. They had become her mantra, her guiding principle. No matter how difficult things got, she would push forward. And as she grew older, she came to realize that it was this perseverance that would eventually lead her to a life filled with opportunities. Opportunities she had once thought were beyond her reach. When Sarah graduated from high school, she was the first in her family to do so. It was a moment of pride for her parents, and for Sarah, it was the beginning of a new chapter. She went on to college, earning a degree in education, and began her career as a teacher in a small rural school. It was there that she found her calling, working with children, helping them unlock their potential, and guiding them through the lessons she had learned herself. But as the years passed, Sarah found that teaching was not the only thing that brought her joy. She had a passion for writing, and when she wasn't teaching, she was writing in her journal, capturing her thoughts, her ideas, and her dreams. Writing became a way for Sarah to process the world around her, a way for her to make sense of the complexities of life. In her 40s, Sarah published her first book, a memoir that detailed her struggles, her triumphs, and the lessons she had learned throughout her life. It was a labor of love, and though it was not a bestseller, it was well received by those who read it. The experience taught Sarah that success was not always measured by external validation, but by the personal fulfillment that came from following one's passions. Yet, despite her achievements, Sarah still felt as though something was missing. She had a loving family, a successful career, and a fulfilling creative outlet, but she was often haunted by the question, what more could I have done? As Sarah grew older, she began to recognize the importance of embracing the present moment. She realized that for much of her life, she had been looking forward to the future, waiting for the next achievement, the next milestone, the next big thing. But now, as she looked back on her life, she understood that it was the moment she had experienced, the people she had loved, and the lessons she had learned along the way that truly mattered. There were times in her younger years when she had been consumed by ambition, driven by a need to prove herself. But as she sat in her small cottage reflecting on her life, Sarah realized that true wisdom came not from what she had accomplished, but from how she had lived. It came from the way she had learned to embrace the imperfections of life, to find beauty in the small moments, and to accept that not everything was within her control. Looking back, Sarah could see the ways in which her own wisdom had evolved. She had learned that success wasn't about accumulating accolades or possessions. It was about finding contentment, about being at peace with oneself. She had learned that relationships were the most important thing in life, and that love, compassion, and connection were the things that truly made life worth living. As Sarah sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had lived a full life, a life rich with experiences, relationships, and lessons. And though there were moments of regret, times when she wished she had done things differently, she understood now that everything had led her to this moment. The wisdom she had gained over the years had not been something she could have planned for or predicted. It had been forged in the fires of experience, in the quiet moments of reflection, and in the relationships that had shaped her. Sarah smiled to herself, knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be. The road to wisdom hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had lived her life with purpose, with passion, and with resilience. And now, as she looked out at the world around her, she was ready for whatever the future would bring. Sarah sat quietly by her window, the soft rustle of leaves from the trees outside the only sound in the room. She had always loved the peaceful solitude of the evenings, when the world outside seemed to slow down and everything felt calmer. At 82 years old, Sarah had learned that patience was one of the most important virtues she could cultivate. But it hadn't always been that way. In fact, when she was younger, patience had been a concept she struggled to understand. Growing up, Sarah had been eager to get ahead. She was ambitious, determined to make something of herself, and she often found herself rushing through life, never content to simply be. There were always more goals to achieve, more things to do, and more success to be had. She believed that if she worked hard enough, she could reach her dreams quickly. And while she did achieve many things in life, she now saw how that rush had made her miss out on some of the most important moments that couldn't be hurried. Sarah remembered the days when she first started teaching. She was eager to make a difference, to prove herself in the classroom. She would arrive early and leave late, working tirelessly to prepare lessons, grade papers, and make sure everything was perfect. She wanted to be the best teacher, the one who changed lives. But despite her hard work, there were days when things didn't go according to plan. Some students struggled to keep up, and she found herself frustrated with their lack of progress. She wanted to fix everything right away, to make her students succeed on her timeline. But it was in those moments of frustration that she began to understand the value of patience. It wasn't an easy lesson to learn, but over time, Sarah realized that true change and growth, whether in herself or her students, didn't happen overnight. She learned that it was okay for things to take time, for progress to be slow. Some students needed more time to grasp the material, and some days she needed more time to process her own emotions. The work she was doing wasn't something that could be rushed. It was a slow and steady process of learning and growing for both her and the people she taught. As Sarah grew older, the lessons of patience continued to unfold. When she retired from teaching, she had more time to focus on her own passions, like painting. But again, she found herself impatient. She wanted to be a skilled painter right away, to create masterpieces with every brushstroke. But no matter how hard she tried, the paintings didn't come out the way she had envisioned. The colors weren't as vibrant as she hoped, the lines were uneven, and she was constantly frustrated with her progress. It was in these moments of frustration that Sarah realized something profound. Patience was not just about waiting. It was about accepting the journey, embracing the process. She began to understand that every mistake, every imperfection was part of the learning process. Just as in her teaching career, she needed to give herself permission to grow, to take her time, and to trust that the skills would come, just like the students in her class had eventually learned at their own pace. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting in her studio, staring at her latest painting. She had been working on it for weeks, trying to capture the essence of the landscape outside her window. But it wasn't coming together the way she had hoped. Her brushstrokes felt rushed, and the colors seemed dull compared to what she had imagined. She was about to set the painting aside, frustrated once again, when she paused. She looked at the painting, really looked at it, and noticed the small details that were actually quite beautiful. The way the light hit the trees, the way the colors blended together in unexpected ways. Sarah smiled to herself. She realized that, just like in life, the imperfections in the painting made it unique. The process had taken longer than she had expected, but that was part of the beauty. Sarah had learned that true patience wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment or for things to happen quickly. It was about allowing things to unfold in their own time, trusting that each step of the process, whether it was in painting, teaching, or life, was meaningful in its own right. Later that week, Sarah visited a friend who had been struggling with health issues. As they sat together, Sarah listened patiently as her friend spoke about the challenges she had been facing. Her friend expressed frustration at not feeling better quickly, at not seeing the progress she had hoped for. Sarah gently reminded her that healing, like everything else, takes time. "It's okay to be patient with yourself," she said softly. "Healing doesn't happen overnight, but every day you're getting stronger." Her friend smiled, clearly comforted by Sarah's words. It was then that Sarah realized that her own patience was not just for herself, it was something she could offer to others as well. She had spent so many years learning to be patient with her own journey, and now she could use that wisdom to help others navigate their own struggles. As Sarah reflected on her life, she realized that the greatest lessons she had learned had come from moments of stillness, of waiting, of allowing things to unfold at their own pace. It was in those moments of patience that she had found peace and understanding. Sarah knew that patience was not a quality that came easily to most people. It was something that had to be nurtured over time. But she also knew that patience was a gift, both to herself and to others. It allowed her to embrace the beauty of the present moment, to trust that everything would come in its own time. And most importantly, it allowed her to live a life that was rich with meaning, free from the pressure to rush or force things to happen. As Sarah sat by the window watching the sun set on another peaceful evening, she felt a deep sense of contentment. She had learned that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a way of life. And with that understanding, she felt ready for whatever the future would bring. As Sarah sat in her living room one afternoon, the sun casting a golden glow over the room, she couldn't help but think back to the years when she held grudges against people who had wronged her. She had spent much of her life carrying the weight of those past hurts, convinced that forgiveness was something that was earned, not freely given. Her relationship with her sister Evelyn had been one of the most complicated ones in her life. Growing up, they had been close. sharing everything from secrets to dreams. But as they got older, things started to change. Evelyn had married young, and Sarah had thrown herself into her career, moving to a different city. Time and distance created a divide between them, and soon the closeness they once shared seemed like a distant memory. It wasn't until years later, when Sarah was in her late 40s, that she learned about the betrayal that had caused a rift between them. Sarah had been furious when she found out that Evelyn had been spreading lies about her to their relatives, tarnishing Sarah's reputation. The betrayal cut deep, and for years, Sarah couldn't bring herself to speak to her sister. She felt hurt and angry, and the thought of forgiving Evelyn seemed impossible. But over time, as Sarah continued on her journey of self-reflection, she began to realize something. Holding on to that anger and bitterness was only hurting her. It was keeping her from moving forward, from living fully. The more she held on to her resentment, the more it consumed her. It took away her peace, her joy, and it prevented her from experiencing the freedom that comes with letting go of the past. One day, after a particularly difficult week, Sarah sat down with her journal. She began to write about her feelings, about Evelyn, about the betrayal, and about the weight of anger that she had carried for so long. As she wrote, the words flowed out of her, and she realized something profound. Forgiveness was not about the other person. It wasn't about excusing their actions or forgetting what had happened. It was about freeing herself from the chains of anger, about releasing herself from the grip of the past. Forgiveness, Sarah learned, was a gift she gave to herself. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it was necessary. She didn't need to continue holding on to the pain, to the anger that had kept her from experiencing peace. It was time to let go, not for Evelyn's sake, but for her own. The next time Sarah saw Evelyn, it was at a family gathering. The sight of her sister brought back all of the old feelings, hurt, anger, betrayal. But this time, Sarah was different. She had spent so much time in her own reflection that she had come to understand something vital. Forgiveness was about releasing the hold that the past had on her. And so, without thinking too much about it, she walked over to Evelyn. "Evelyn," Sarah said quietly, her voice shaky but sincere, "I've been holding on to anger for far too long. I've realized that I need to let go of it for my own peace. I forgive you." Evelyn looked up, surprise in her eyes. She had expected an argument, or at least a cold reception, but instead she saw something in Sarah's eyes that she hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. Sarah wasn't asking for an apology or for the past to be erased. She was simply offering a clean slate, for herself as much as for Evelyn. I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered. "I was wrong and I hurt you. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it." Sarah nodded, the weight on her shoulders lifting. She didn't need to hear the words from Evelyn. The forgiveness was already hers. In that moment, Sarah felt a peace settle over her that she had not felt in years. The anger and the pain were no longer a part of her. She had let them go, and she was free. Forgiveness didn't mean that Sarah had to forget the past or pretend that the hurt never happened. It didn't mean that she and Evelyn would be as close as they once were. But what it did mean was that Sarah could move forward without the burden of resentment. She could now live with an open heart, knowing that she had released herself from the prison of anger. As Sarah reflected on the day, she realized that forgiveness had also extended to herself. She had spent so much time blaming herself for the past, wondering if she could have done things differently. She had carried guilt over things she couldn't change, and it had weighed heavily on her spirit. But forgiveness, Sarah had learned, was about recognizing that everyone, including herself, was imperfect. It was about accepting that mistakes were part of being human and that healing could only happen when she was willing to forgive herself as much as she forgave others. In the following weeks, Sarah's relationship with Evelyn began to heal. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They spoke more openly, with less judgment and more understanding. They learned to accept each other's flaws, knowing that forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it allowed them to build a future together, one step at a time. Sarah knew that there would be other moments in her life when she would have to practice forgiveness, both for herself and others. But she was no longer afraid of it. She understood now that forgiveness was not just a choice, it was a path to freedom, to peace, and to joy. As Sarah sat by the window one evening, looking out at the world beyond, she smiled softly to herself. She had learned that forgiveness was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. It was a powerful force that allowed her to move forward, to live with an open heart, and to embrace the wisdom of age. As Sarah sat in her favorite chair, sipping a cup of tea, she couldn't help but think about the changes that had occurred in her life over the years. At 82, she had lived through countless transformations, both personal and societal. She had seen the world change in ways she never could have imagined, and in the process, she had changed as well. When she was younger, Sarah had always viewed change with apprehension. She was someone who valued stability and predictability. The thought of changing careers, moving to a new place, or trying something completely different felt overwhelming to her. She had always followed a set path, one that was carefully planned and methodical. But as time passed, Sarah realized that the world didn't wait for anyone to catch up. Change was inevitable, and if she didn't learn to embrace it, she would be left behind. The first time Sarah faced a significant change in her life was when her husband Henry passed away. She had been married to him for nearly 50 years, and his death shook her to the core. It felt as though the foundation of her life had crumbled beneath her. Sarah had always relied on Henry for support and companionship. They had built a life together, and now she was faced with the prospect of living alone. For months after his death, Sarah struggled with the absence of her partner. She found herself clinging to the past, holding on to the memories of their time together, unwilling to let go. She couldn't bear the thought of moving forward without him. But eventually she realized that in order to heal, she had to face the reality of change. She had to let go of the past and embrace the future, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Sarah's decision to embrace change wasn't immediate. It took time, and there were moments when she wanted to retreat back into her comfort zone, to stay stuck in the life she had once known. But one day she woke up and made a choice. She would no longer let fear hold her back. She would start living again, even if it meant doing things she had never done before. One of the first steps Sarah took was to revisit her passion for painting. She had always loved art, but it had been years since she had picked up a paintbrush. She had put her artistic dreams on hold for decades while raising a family and caring for Henry. But now, with the house feeling quieter than ever, Sarah decided it was time to reconnect with that part of herself. She signed up for an art class at a local community center and began exploring her creativity once again. At first, Sarah felt uncertain. She was in a room full of younger people, many of whom were more experienced than she was. She couldn't help but wonder if she was too old to start something new. But as she picked up the paintbrush for the first time in years, she felt a sense of freedom that she hadn't felt in a long time. The strokes of color on the canvas were no longer just about making something beautiful. They were about reclaiming a part of herself that had been buried for too long. Sarah's art began to flourish as she let go of the need for perfection. She learned to embrace the imperfections, to see them as part of the process rather than obstacles to overcome. She allowed herself to experiment with different styles and techniques, enjoying the creative process for what it was, an opportunity for self-expression. As Sarah continued painting, she realized that embracing change wasn't just about pursuing new hobbies or interests. It was about allowing herself to grow, to evolve, and to adapt to the circumstances around her. She began to see that life was not a static experience, but a dynamic journey that required flexibility and resilience. But the most profound change Sarah experienced was within herself. She had spent so many years trying to control every aspect of her life, trying to make sure that everything was just right. But now she had learned to let go of the need for control. She had learned to trust that life would unfold as it was meant to, and that she didn't have to have all the answers right away. One of the most significant changes that Sarah had to face came when her children, now adults with families of their own, encouraged her to move closer to them. For years, she had lived in the small house she and Henry had shared, a house filled with memories and familiar surroundings. But as her children became more concerned about her living alone, they suggested that she move to a retirement community closer to them. At first, Sarah resisted the idea. She didn't want to leave the home that had been a part of her life for so long. She was attached to the memories, to the comfort of her surroundings. But after much thought and consideration, Sarah realized that this was another step she had to take. A step that would allow her to embrace the change in her life and continue her journey of self-discovery. Moving to the retirement community wasn't easy, but it turned out to be one of the best decisions Sarah had made. She found new friendships, new activities, and a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just living in the past anymore. She was embracing the future. And for the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of excitement about what was to come. As Sarah reflected on her journey, she realized that change was not something to be feared. It was something to be welcomed. Life was about growth, about transformation, and about learning to adapt to the world around her. She had spent so many years resisting change, but now she understood that it was the key to living a full and meaningful life. Sarah smiled as she picked up her paintbrush once more. She was ready for whatever came next, because she knew that with each new change, she was growing into the person she was meant to be. As Sarah sat quietly in her living room, gazing out at the world beyond, she couldn't help but reflect on the years that had passed. At 82, time had become both her greatest teacher and her most poignant reminder of the fleeting nature of life. She had lived through decades of experiences, some wonderful, some painful, but one thing had become increasingly clear to her: time was precious. In the early years of her life, Sarah had always been in a hurry. There was always something more to accomplish, another goal to reach, another milestone to achieve. She was focused on the future, driven by the belief that time would eventually slow down once she arrived at the life she envisioned. But now, as she looked back, Sarah realized that she had spent so much of her life rushing through the moments, not fully appreciating the present. It wasn't until she faced the loss of her husband, Henry, that Sarah truly began to grasp the value of time. Henry had been her partner for over 50 years, and his death had shaken her in ways she never could have anticipated. In the days and weeks following his passing, Sarah found herself reflecting on the time they had spent together, on the moments that seemed so insignificant at the time, but now felt so precious. She remembered the quiet evenings they had shared, sitting side by side, talking about everything and nothing. She remembered the mornings when they would take walks together, hand in hand, enjoying the simple beauty of the world around them. She remembered the laughter, the struggles, and the love they had shared. And now all those moments were gone, replaced by an empty space that she had to learn to live with. For the first time in her life, Sarah began to see time not as something to be rushed through, but as something to be savored. She realized that every moment, no matter how small, was precious. The time she had spent with Henry, the time she had spent raising her children, the time she had spent pursuing her passions, all of it was part of the story of her life, and all of it mattered. But it wasn't just the past that Sarah found herself reflecting on. She also began to think more deeply about how she was spending her time now. As she had gotten older, she realized that time was no longer something she could take for granted. She didn't know how much time she had left, and that made her all the more determined to live each day fully. It wasn't about doing more, it was about doing what mattered. Sarah had learned that time wasn't just about quantity, but about quality. She no longer felt the need to fill every moment with activity. Instead, she focused on the things that brought her joy, peace, and fulfillment. Painting, spending time with her children, volunteering at the local community center. These were the things that made her feel truly alive. Sarah had also learned the importance of being present in the moment. She no longer allowed herself to be consumed by the past or worried about the future. She had spent so many years anxious about what was to come, always looking ahead and missing the beauty of the present. But now she made an effort to truly experience each moment, to savor the simple pleasures of life. One of the greatest gifts Sarah had received in her later years was the opportunity to spend more time with her grandchildren. She had watched them grow up so quickly, and now she cherished every moment she spent with them. Whether it was reading them stories, taking them to the park, or simply enjoying a quiet afternoon together, Sarah found immense joy in these moments. She realized that time with family was the most precious gift of all. As Sarah spent more time with her grandchildren, she also began to notice the way they interacted with the world. They were so full of wonder, so eager to explore, and they seemed to have an innate ability to live fully in the present. Sarah found herself learning from them, observing how they approached each day with curiosity and excitement. They reminded her that time, while limited, was meant to be experienced with enthusiasm, with joy, and with an open heart. It was during one of these moments, sitting in the garden with her grandchildren, that Sarah had a realization. She had spent so many years focused on what she didn't have, time, success, achievements, that she had failed to appreciate what she already had, the love of her family, the beauty of the world around her, and the ability to live in the moment. That evening, as she tucked her grandchildren into bed and kissed them goodnight, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that her time on this earth was finite, but she also knew that she had the power to make every moment count. She didn't need to be famous or wealthy. She just needed to live with intention, to cherish the people and experiences that truly mattered. As Sarah sat by the window that night, she thought about how much she had learned in her 82 years. She had learned that time was both a gift and a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of living fully. She had learned that the true value of time wasn't in what she accomplished, but in how she spent it. And she had learned that every moment, no matter how small, was worth cherishing. Sarah smiled to herself, knowing that the time she had left would be spent wisely. She would continue painting, continue loving her family, continue living with joy. She would continue to savor each day, knowing that the moments she experienced now would shape the legacy she left behind. As Sarah sat in the cozy living room of her cottage, she looked around and thought about the people who had shaped her life. She had always known that family was important, but as she grew older, she began to understand just how crucial those relationships were. Family was the anchor that kept her grounded, and community was the support system that lifted her up when life became too heavy to carry alone. Sarah had spent much of her youth focused on her career and personal goals. She had always valued independence, believing that she had to achieve everything on her own. But as the years went by, and especially after Henry's passing, she realized how vital her family was to her sense of well-being. They had always been there for her, even when she hadn't fully appreciated it. Her children, now adults with families of their own, had been a constant source of comfort and support. Despite the busy lives they led, they always made time for Sarah, checking in on her regularly and visiting her as often as they could. Sarah had come to realize that the relationships she had with her children and grandchildren were her greatest treasures. One afternoon, as Sarah was having tea with her daughter, Lily, they talked about how much Sarah had changed over the years. Lily smiled warmly at her mother, admiring the strength and wisdom she had gained. "Mom, you've always been there for us, but now I see how much you've opened up and how much you've learned about the importance of family. It's like you've realized that it's okay to lean on us too." Sarah smiled softly, nodding in agreement. "I guess I have," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I spent so many years trying to do everything on my own, thinking I had to be strong all the time. But I've learned that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to lean on the people who love you." That afternoon, Lily stayed with Sarah for hours, reminiscing about the past and sharing stories from her own life. They laughed, they cried, and they connected on a level that was deeper than ever before. Sarah realized how much she had missed these simple moments, moments of connection, of being present with the ones she loved. But family wasn't just limited to blood relatives for Sarah. Over the years, she had built a network of close friends and neighbors who had become her extended family. These people were her support system, her community. When Sarah had moved into the retirement community, she had been nervous at first. It felt like another major change in her life, and she wasn't sure how she would adjust. But as she settled in, Sarah discovered that the community around her was more than just a place to live. It was a place where people cared for one another, where they shared their experiences, their struggles, and their triumphs. Sarah had quickly made new friends, people who were also navigating the challenges of aging and finding new ways to connect with life. It was in this community that she learned that no one should have to face the later years of life alone. One of Sarah's closest friends in the retirement community was Margaret, a fellow widow who had also lost her spouse after many years of marriage. Margaret and Sarah had bonded over their shared experiences of loss and grief, and they often spent hours talking about their lives, their families, and the changes they had faced. Margaret had been a great comfort to Sarah, providing emotional support and encouragement when Sarah needed it most. One evening, as the two women sat together on the patio watching the sun set, Margaret turned to Sarah and said, "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about how much we've changed. When I first moved here, I was so afraid of being alone. I didn't know how I would cope without my husband. But I've learned that community, family, and friendship, they're the things that keep us going. We don't have to do this alone." Sarah nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the people in her life. She had spent so many years thinking that strength came from independence, but now she realized that true strength came from connection, connecting with others, leaning on them when needed, and offering support in return. Over the years, Sarah had also volunteered at the local community center, helping organize events and activities for the elderly. She had met so many people there who, like her, were looking for a sense of purpose and belonging. Volunteering had become a way for Sarah to give back, to share her wisdom with others, and to continue contributing to her community in a meaningful way. Through these experiences, she had learned that there was no greater joy than helping others, especially those who were facing similar challenges in life. One of the greatest lessons Sarah had learned about family and community was that love was not confined to any one person. Love was something that could be shared with everyone, whether it was through family, friendships, or acts of kindness. And in her later years, Sarah had found a deep sense of peace in knowing that she was surrounded by people who cared about her, who supported her, and who were willing to share their lives with her. As Sarah sat in the community center one afternoon watching a group of children play with the elderly residents, she smiled to herself. She realized that life had come full circle. When she was young, her parents had taught her the importance of family and community, and now, as she sat among the people she had grown to love and cherish, she understood those lessons more deeply than ever. The children's laughter echoed through the room, and Sarah felt a sense of warmth in her heart. She was no longer the young woman who had once feared that her life would be defined by her achievements or successes. Now she knew that her life had been defined by the people she had loved, the people who had loved her, and the community she had built over the years. And as she looked around at the faces of her family, her friends, and her neighbors, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had lived a life rich in love, in connection, and in community. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As Sarah sat in the peaceful quiet of her cottage, the sun casting long shadows across the room, she found herself reflecting on the many years of her life. At 82, she had lived through both triumphs and failures, moments of joy and times of sorrow. There were many things she had done in her life that she was proud of, but there were also choices she regretted deeply. Regret was a heavy burden to carry, one that Sarah had held on to for far too long. She had spent many years looking back at the decisions she had made and wondering what might have been if she had chosen differently. She often thought about her first marriage, which had ended in divorce after just a few years. At the time, she had believed it was the right choice, but now, as she looked back, she wondered if there was something more she could have done to save the relationship. There were other regrets too, times when she had chosen career advancement over spending time with her children, moments when she had let fear dictate her choices, and times when she had been too hard on herself for not being perfect. Sarah had spent so many years holding on to these regrets, allowing them to shape her view of herself and her life. But over time, she had come to realize that holding on to these regrets was only preventing her from moving forward. She could spend the rest of her life looking back, wondering about the past, or she could choose to let go of those regrets and focus on the present. It was a difficult decision to make, but Sarah knew that it was time to release the weight of her past mistakes and forgive herself for the things she could no longer change. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting by the window, watching the rain fall softly outside. It was a peaceful moment, and yet, as she looked out at the world, she felt the familiar tug of regret in her heart. She thought about all the years she had spent living with guilt, wondering how different her life might have been if she had made different choices. But then something inside her shifted. She realized that she had spent so much time wishing she could change the past, but the past was gone. What mattered now was what she did with the time she had left. What mattered was how she chose to live today, not how she had lived yesterday. It was then that Sarah made the decision to let go of her regrets. She had carried them long enough, and she knew that they no longer had the power to define her. She was no longer the person who had made those choices. She was someone who had grown, who had learned from her mistakes, and who had found peace in accepting that imperfection was part of being human. Sarah had spent so many years being hard on herself, judging herself for the things she had done and the things she had left undone. But now she saw that those mistakes were not something to be ashamed of. They were part of her story, part of the journey that had brought her to where she was today. She realized that the most important thing was not whether she had made mistakes, but how she had learned from them. That evening, Sarah sat down with her journal and wrote a letter to herself. It was a letter of forgiveness, a letter that let go of the past and embraced the present. She wrote about the mistakes she had made, the things she wished she could have done differently, and how she had learned to forgive herself for those things. She wrote about the lessons she had learned and the person she had become. "Dear Sarah," she wrote, "I forgive you. I forgive you for the mistakes you made, for the choices you wish you could have changed, for the things you left unsaid. You are not defined by your past. You are defined by how you choose to live today. You are enough, just as you are, and I'm proud of the person you've become." As Sarah finished writing, she felt a sense of release. It was as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had finally let go of the regret that had held her back for so long. She no longer needed to look back at the past with shame or sorrow. The past was part of her story, but it did not have to dictate her future. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself living with a newfound sense of peace. The voice of regret that had haunted her for years had quieted, replaced by a sense of acceptance and gratitude. She began to appreciate the present moment, knowing that each day was a gift. The future was uncertain, but she no longer feared it. She was ready to embrace whatever came next, with open arms and an open heart. One of the most significant changes that Sarah experienced was in her relationships. She had always been a loving mother and grandmother, but the weight of regret had sometimes kept her from fully connecting with those she loved. Now, with the burden of the past lifted, she found herself more present with her family. She laughed more, shared more, and embraced the time she had with them. Sarah also found herself reaching out to old friends, reconnecting with people she had lost touch with over the years. She realized that life was too short to hold grudges, to carry the weight of regret. She wanted to spend her time making memories, building connections, and living fully. As Sarah sat in the garden one afternoon, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she felt a deep sense of contentment. She had lived a life full of ups and downs, but she had learned that the most important thing was not to dwell on the past, but to live in the present and embrace the future with open arms. She had let go of her regrets, and in doing so, she had found freedom. Looking around at the people she loved, Sarah realized that her journey had led her to exactly where she was meant to be. She had learned the importance of forgiveness, of patience, of embracing change, and of living each day with intention. And now, as she looked at her family, she knew that her story was far from over. She still had so much more to give, so much more to experience, and so much more love to share. As Sarah sat by the window, watching the world go by, she reflected on the years she had lived and the countless experiences that had shaped her. It was a beautiful afternoon, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah found herself filled with a deep sense of gratitude. She had spent much of her life rushing, trying to achieve more, to be more, but now in her later years, she realized that the most important thing was to simply appreciate what she had. In her younger years, Sarah had always been focused on the next goal, the next achievement. She had been driven by ambition, always striving for more, believing that success and fulfillment were found in external accomplishments. But as she grew older, she came to understand that true happiness didn't come from what she achieved, but from how she experienced the world and how she appreciated the people and moments around her. For so many years, Sarah had been caught up in the idea of more. More success, more recognition, more material possessions. She had worked hard to climb the ladder of success, to prove herself to the world. But when Henry passed away and she found herself standing at the end of one chapter of her life, Sarah realized how little those things mattered in the grand scheme of things. What really mattered were the relationships she had built, the love she had shared, and the memories she had created along the way. As Sarah looked around her home, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life she had lived. There had been ups and downs, moments of joy and sorrow, but each one of those experiences had shaped her into the person she was today. The house she had shared with Henry, the one that was now filled with memories, was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of all that she had experienced, all that she had learned, and all that she had to be thankful for. One of the most powerful lessons Sarah had learned in her later years was the importance of being grateful for the present moment. So often, she had been focused on the future, on what she wanted to achieve or accomplish. But now she understood that life wasn't just about what you had or what you would have. It was about appreciating what you already had. Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude when she thought about her children and grandchildren. They were her greatest gifts, and she realized how much she had taken for granted in the past. She had always been there for them, guiding them, teaching them, loving them. But as she reflected on her role as a mother and grandmother, she saw just how much they had given her in return. They had brought her so much joy, so much laughter, and so much love. There were days when Sarah felt overwhelmed by the demands of life, raising children, working, managing a household. It all seemed like too much at times. But now she saw those moments differently. She saw them as the building blocks of her life, the things that had shaped her into the woman she was today. And for that, she was grateful. Sarah also learned to be grateful for the small moments, the ones that often went unnoticed. A quiet afternoon spent reading a book, a cup of tea shared with a friend, the sound of birds chirping in the morning. These were the things that brought her peace. They were the moments that reminded her that life wasn't always about big accomplishments or grand gestures. Sometimes the most meaningful moments were the quiet, simple ones. In her later years, Sarah had learned to live with intention. She no longer rushed through her days, chasing after things that didn't truly matter. Instead, she focused on what brought her joy and fulfillment. Whether it was spending time with her family, painting, or simply enjoying the beauty of nature, Sarah had learned to be present in the moment and to appreciate the life she had. One day, as Sarah was walking through the park, she noticed a young woman sitting on a bench, looking down at her phone. Sarah smiled to herself as she observed the woman, who seemed so absorbed in her screen that she barely noticed the world around her. Sarah could relate to that feeling. She had once been so focused on the future that she had missed the beauty of the present. But now she had learned to slow down, to notice the little things, and to be grateful for the world around her. As Sarah continued her walk, she thought about how much she had changed over the years. She had gone from being someone who was always striving for more to someone who now understood the value of enough. She had learned that life wasn't about accumulating possessions or achievements. It was about living with purpose, with gratitude, and with love. Later that evening, as Sarah sat down to dinner with her family, she felt a deep sense of contentment. She looked around the table at the people she loved most, her children, her grandchildren, and her dear friends, and she realized that these were the moments that truly mattered. This was what life was about: sharing meals, telling stories, and making memories with the people who meant the most to her. As Sarah raised her glass in a toast to her family, she smiled and said, "I am so grateful for all of you. You've made my life richer than I could ever have imagined." And in that moment, Sarah understood something truly profound. Gratitude was not just a feeling, it was a way of life. It was about finding joy in the small moments, appreciating what you had, and living each day with an open heart. It was about recognizing that no matter how much time you had left, the most important thing was how you spent it and who you spent it with. Sarah had spent much of her life believing that hope was something intangible, something abstract that only appeared in moments of joy or inspiration. But as she sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking out over the garden, she realized that hope had been the quiet force that had carried her through every challenge, every heartbreak, and every trial she had faced. In her younger years, hope had been something Sarah relied on instinctively. It had been the feeling that things would get better, the belief that no matter how difficult life became, there was always the possibility of a brighter future. She had clung to hope during the tough times, during moments of doubt and uncertainty. It was hope that had driven her to continue pursuing her dreams, even when the road ahead seemed impossible. But now, as an older woman, Sarah understood that hope was not just about wishing for a better tomorrow. It was about the belief that things could improve, no matter the circumstances. Hope was a choice, a conscious decision to look for the light even when it seemed dark. It was the quiet belief that change was possible and that there was always something worth looking forward to. The past few years had taught Sarah just how powerful hope could be. After Henry's death, she had been devastated. The world seemed much darker without him, and for a long time she had felt lost, unsure of how to move forward. The emptiness in her home was overwhelming, and Sarah had wondered if she would ever feel whole again. But through the sorrow, she had discovered something unexpected: hope. It hadn't come immediately. At first, she had felt as though her world had ended, but over time, she found small sparks of hope flickering in the darkness. It was in the laughter of her grandchildren, in the quiet moments spent painting, and in the new friendships she had formed at the retirement community. Hope didn't appear in grand gestures, but in the subtle, everyday moments that brought her peace and comfort. One afternoon, as Sarah sat outside on the porch, watching the sun begin to set, she thought about all the people in her life who had given her hope. She thought about her children who had supported her through the most difficult times. She thought about her friends who had shared their own stories of resilience and survival. And she thought about her grandchildren, whose innocent joy reminded her of the beauty in the world. Her friend Margaret, who had lost her husband many years ago, had taught Sarah another important lesson about hope. Margaret often spoke of how, in the darkest moments of her life, she had clung to hope like a lifeline. Hope is what gets us through the hard times, Margaret had told Sarah during one of their many conversations. It's what keeps us moving forward, even when we don't know what the future holds. Those words stayed with Sarah as she navigated her own journey through grief. She had learned that hope wasn't about having all the answers. It wasn't about knowing exactly how things would turn out. Hope was about trusting that, even in the face of uncertainty, there was always the possibility of something better. It was the courage to keep going, even when the way forward seemed unclear. In her later years, Sarah also found hope in the small things. The moments that, at first, seemed insignificant but had become powerful reminders of life's beauty. The sound of birds singing in the morning, the laughter of children playing, the scent of flowers blooming in the garden. These were the things that kept her heart open, that kept her looking forward to the next day with anticipation. One day, as Sarah was sitting with her daughter Lily, they talked about the challenges they had both faced in their lives. Lily had been through her own struggles, both in her career and in her personal life. But as they shared their stories, Sarah realized how much hope had been a driving force for both of them. Lily had faced difficult times, but she had always found a way to persevere, to keep going, to believe that things would improve. "You know, Mom," Lily said, her voice filled with emotion, "I've always admired your strength. Even when everything seemed hopeless, you never gave up. You taught me how to keep going no matter how hard it gets." Sarah smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. "Hope is what has kept me going all these years. It's not about the big things, but the small things. The moments of joy, the love we share with each other, the belief that things can get better. It's what keeps us moving forward, even when we can't see the way ahead." As Sarah reflected on those words, she realized that hope had become an integral part of who she was. It had shaped her, guided her, and carried her through every difficult time in her life. It had been the silent strength that allowed her to rise above adversity, to find meaning even in the midst of loss, and to keep moving forward, no matter what life threw her way. Hope, Sarah now understood, was not just a feeling, it was a force. It was the belief that no matter what, there was always something worth living for, something worth striving for. And even as Sarah approached the later years of her life, she knew that hope would continue to guide her. As she looked out at the setting sun, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that the future was uncertain, but she also knew that hope would always be there, lighting the way. She didn't need to have all the answers or know exactly what would happen. What she needed was the belief that no matter what, she would always find a way forward. And with that, Sarah smiled, knowing that hope was the one thing in life that could never be taken from her. It was hers to keep, hers to share, and hers to carry with her every step of the way. As Sarah sat in her favorite armchair, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. The room was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, a beautiful reminder that the love she had cultivated over the years was still alive, thriving, and growing. At 82, Sarah had lived a full life, one filled with challenges, joys, losses, and triumphs. She had spent the past few years reflecting on the lessons she had learned and the wisdom she had gained. And now, as she looked around at the faces of the people she loved most, she realized that it was time to pass on that wisdom. Throughout her life, Sarah had always believed that the true measure of a person's life wasn't in the material things they acquired or the accolades they received. It was in the relationships they built, the love they gave, and the wisdom they shared. And as Sarah grew older, she felt a deep sense of responsibility to share what she had learned with the next generation. Her children and grandchildren, many of whom had grown up in a fast-paced world full of distractions, often turned to Sarah for advice. They admired her ability to stay calm in the face of adversity, her strength, and her unwavering belief in the power of love and hope. But Sarah knew that her wisdom wasn't something she could just give them in a few simple words or stories. It was something they would have to learn for themselves, just as she had. One evening, as Sarah sat down for a quiet dinner with her daughter Lily, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Lily, I've been thinking a lot lately about what I've learned over the years. I want to make sure that I pass on the things that matter most to you and your children. There's so much I wish I could teach you, but I know that the most important lessons are the ones you learn by living. Lily smiled and nodded, understanding the depth of her mother's words. I've learned so much from you already, Mom. You've shown me how to live with love, with hope, and with purpose. But I know there's still so much more to learn. Sarah paused, reflecting on her own experiences. You know, life isn't always easy. There will be times when you feel lost, when you wonder if things will ever get better. But I want you to remember this. The most important thing in life is to never give up. You have to keep moving forward, even when it feels impossible. Keep your heart open to love, to kindness, and to the beauty around you. And never forget that family is everything. Lily smiled again, her eyes glistening with emotion. I'll remember that, Mom. Thank you. As Sarah shared these words with her daughter, she realized that her role in the family wasn't just to guide or to teach. It was to be a living example of the lessons she had learned. Lessons of resilience, of hope, and of unconditional love. She didn't need to tell her family everything they needed to know. She just needed to live those lessons and let them learn from the way she lived her life. Later that evening, as Sarah sat down with her grandchildren, she felt a sense of peace. The house was filled with the laughter of her young ones, and Sarah felt so much joy in seeing the next generation grow and thrive. They were the future, and it was her responsibility to ensure that they had the tools they needed to live meaningful, fulfilling lives. You know, Grandma, one of her grandsons said, you always tell us to be kind to others. I think that's one of the most important things we can do. It's like when you help us with our homework, you make us feel like we can do anything. Sarah smiled warmly at her grandson, her heart swelling with pride. Kindness is one of the most important things you can offer to the world. When you're kind, you make the world a better place, and you make the people around you feel loved and valued. Never underestimate the power of a kind word or a helping hand. As Sarah watched her grandchildren interact with one another, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that the wisdom she had shared with them, the lessons of love, kindness, and perseverance, would continue long after she was gone. And that was what mattered most. Her legacy wasn't in the things she had accomplished or the awards she had received. It was in the hearts of the people she had touched, in the lives she had influenced, and in the love she had given. In the years to come, Sarah continued to pass on her wisdom, not just to her children and grandchildren, but to the people in her community. She volunteered at local schools, helping young students with their studies and offering them guidance on how to approach life with kindness and resilience. She mentored younger women, teaching them the importance of self-care, self-love, and the strength that comes from within. Sarah knew that she couldn't control the future, but she also knew that she had the power to shape it. By passing on her wisdom, she was giving the next generation the tools they needed to face the challenges of life with courage, grace, and hope. One evening, as Sarah sat on her porch, watching the sun set over the hills, she felt a deep sense of contentment. She had lived a full life, one rich in experiences, love, and wisdom. And now, as she looked at her children and grandchildren, she knew that her story would continue, not just in the memories of those who loved her, but in the way they lived their lives, guided by the wisdom she had shared. Sarah had passed on the most valuable thing she had, the wisdom of age. And in doing so, she had ensured that her legacy would live on, forever carried in the hearts of those who had listened to her, learned from her, and loved her.